Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into something that feels modern, but actually has surprisingly deep roots: the origins of environmental thought. Let me ask you something. When did we, as a society, first start caring about the environment? Was it the 60s? Maybe Earth Day? What if I told you the seeds of modern environmentalism were planted long before that, by poets, wanderers, and dreamers who walked through the woods and saw more than just trees? They saw meaning. Let's go back to the 1800s. Picture towering forests untouched by chainsaws, wild rivers flowing free, and a few bold voices rising up to say, this is worth protecting. People like Henry David Thoreau and John Muir weren't just nature lovers, they were philosophical heavyweights. Thoreau retreated to Walden Pond and declared that nature had intrinsic value, not because it served us, but because it simply was. Muir, on the other hand, took that reverence and turned it into action, helping lay the groundwork for the American conservation movement. Then we see something remarkable: the beginning of institutional preservation. In 1872, Yellowstone was declared the first national park in the United States. That's nearly 100 years before the first Earth Day. Why? It was a blend of civic pride and ecological concern. People were beginning to recognize that nature wasn't an endless resource. It was a legacy, one that needed to be protected, not just admired. But it wasn't all romanticism and philosophy. By the late 1800s, things started to change. Cities were swelling, factories belched smoke into the sky, rivers turned black with waste. This wasn't just progress, it was a wake-up call. Industrial pollution, overcrowding, and rampant deforestation created a visible scar on the landscape. People began to connect the dots between human activity and environmental degradation. The consequences were no longer theoretical, they were happening in real time. So in this early period, we see three forces coming together: a love for untouched nature, a political push to preserve it, and a growing anxiety about what we might be losing in the name of progress. And that's just the beginning. Ready for the next chapter in this environmental story? Let's move on to the aftermath of World War II, the economic boom, and the birth of modern environmentalism. Let's fast forward to the mid-20th century, an era of booming suburbs, shiny cars, and post-war optimism. The soldiers had returned, factories had shifted from tanks to toasters, and America was building fast. But here's the twist: all that growth came at a cost. The post-war expansion brought a tidal wave of industrial activity, highway construction, and consumerism. Fossil fuel dependence skyrocketed. Forests were cleared for housing developments. Rivers became chemical dumping grounds. The air? Thick with smog. It was a golden age of prosperity and an ecological breaking point. And then, one voice cut through the noise. In 1962, Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring. It was poetic, it was chilling, and it was revolutionary. She exposed the hidden dangers of pesticides, particularly DDT, and how they were poisoning birds, contaminating water, and creeping into our own food chain. Carson wasn't just writing about bugs and chemicals. She was calling out an entire system of unchecked industrial practices. And people listened. Her book sparked a wave of public awareness and gave rise to modern ecological consciousness. This momentum boiled over into political action. By 1970, a new milestone emerged: Earth Day. On April 22nd of that year, over 20 million Americans, yes, 20 million, took to the streets to demand environmental protections. This was no longer just about wilderness. It was about clean air, clean water, and human health. And the government responded. The Environmental Protection Agency was established later that same year. Major legislation followed: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and more. Suddenly, environmental regulation wasn't fringe, it was federal. But something else happened, too. A new way of thinking crept in, one that framed pollution not just as a moral or aesthetic failure, but as an economic one. Economists began using the word externalities, costs that corporations push onto society, like dumping waste into a river rather than paying to dispose of it properly. Regulation, in this view, wasn't anti-business, it was a market correction, a way to account for damage that wouldn't otherwise show up on the balance sheet. So by the 1970s, environmentalism had matured. It was no longer just about preserving nature, it was about holding polluters accountable, protecting public health, and rethinking the relationship between industry and ecology. But this raises a fundamental question: should protecting the environment be top-down or bottom-up? And what happens when those approaches clash? That's exactly what we'll explore in the next section. Let's keep going. So now we come to a crossroads, one that still shapes environmental policy today. Once environmental awareness went mainstream in the 70s, the big question wasn't just what to do, but how to do it. Should governments take the lead through strict regulations? Or should markets drive change through innovation and incentives? Let's start with the centralized approach, often called command and control policies. This is where governments set the rules, emissions caps, technology mandates, regulatory bodies to enforce compliance. Picture a top-down model. The state identifies the problem and then tells everyone how to fix it, sometimes with stiff penalties for those who don't comply. It's a model that aims for clarity, uniformity, and fast action. But like any system, it has its flaws. Too much central control can lead to what economists call regulatory capture, when the very industries being regulated end up influencing the regulators. It can also lead to inefficiencies. Think red tape, or worse, black markets, where rules spark illicit behaviors like illegal logging or falsifying emissions data. Remember the Volkswagen emissions scandal? That's not ancient history. It's a modern policy pitfall. Now, contrast that with market-based solutions. Instead of rigid rules, this model uses incentives to drive change. Think carbon pricing. Think property rights. Think entrepreneurs developing clean energy tech not because they're told to, but because it makes economic sense. This is the bottom-up model. It relies on decentralized innovation. You get competition, creativity, and adaptation. Clean energy startups emerge. Property owners have a stake in maintaining healthy ecosystems. And instead of compliance out of fear, you get participation out of profit. Neither approach is perfect. Command and control can be decisive, but blunt. Market innovation can be nimble, but uneven. So the debate isn't just about which works. It's about which aligns better with human behavior, economic incentives, and long-term sustainability. And that debate sets the stage for a deeper shift in thinking, one that reimagines not just how we regulate pollution, but how we design the entire economy itself. Let's talk about that next. The rise of the green economy and the circular model. Alright, here's where things get a little more radical, in a good way. Imagine an economy that doesn't treat nature like a vending machine, one that doesn't just take, use, and toss, but instead loops materials back into the system like a well-designed ecosystem. That's the idea behind the circular economy. The goal? Continuous reuse and recycling. Instead of the old linear model, extract, produce, consume, discard, we shift to a regenerative one. Think composting instead of landfills. Think modular phones you can upgrade instead of toss. It's a vision that redefines waste as a design flaw, not an inevitable byproduct of growth. But the movement doesn't stop there. Some advocates take it a step further, into the realm of what's called degrowth. Now, this term makes some people uneasy, because it sounds like an anti-progress slogan. But it's really about questioning what we're growing. Degrowth doesn't mean shutting down society. It means scaling back overproduction, overconsumption, and aligning human activity with planetary boundaries. It asks, do we really need more, or do we need better? And then we have the Green New Deals, policy-driven visions that propose massive investment in sustainable infrastructure, clean energy jobs, and labor transitions away from carbon-heavy industries. These are ambitious, top-down strategies aimed at re-engineering the economy to prioritize environmental sustainability and social equity. Whether you love or question them, they represent a bold attempt to integrate environmental goals into economic planning at a national scale. But of course, with big visions come big debates. One of the most pressing questions in all of this is ethical. Should sustainability come from voluntary innovation, or from enforced systemic change? Are we empowering people to act responsibly, or are we replacing free choice with mandates? Is it possible to reshape the economy without sacrificing freedom, creativity, or prosperity? These are not simple questions, but they matter, because every policy, every initiative, and every shift in environmental strategy carries with it a set of trade-offs, economic, social, and moral. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in Europe, where environmentalism made the leap from activism to government. Let's take a look. Nowhere has environmentalism become more politically entrenched than in Europe. What began as a grassroots movement fueled by activists and intellectuals soon evolved into a formal political force, complete with parties, platforms, and power. Enter the Green parties. These aren't fringe protest groups anymore. In countries like Germany, Green parties hold real seats, make real decisions, and shape national policies. Their agendas aren't just about planting trees. They're about comprehensive reforms, renewable energy mandates, emissions reduction targets, food systems, urban planning, and more. In some countries, Greens have joined ruling coalitions. That means environmental ideas have moved from protest signs to policy documents. And one of the biggest tools in their arsenal is the European Union's Emissions Trading System, or ETS. This is a continental cap-and-trade program. In theory, it's simple. Governments cap the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted. Companies are given or must buy permits to pollute. If they reduce emissions, they can sell their unused permits. If they exceed their cap, they pay. It's a way to harness market dynamics while staying within environmental limits. But here's where it gets interesting and controversial. As environmentalism becomes more institutionalized, it also becomes more centralized. Policies that once emerged from the ground up are now written by bureaucrats in Brussels. Activist energy is now channeled into state systems. And this raises a subtle but serious question: is something lost in that transition? When environmentalism becomes law, it gains legitimacy, but sometimes loses flexibility. When it becomes bureaucracy, it gains structure, but risks inefficiency. When it becomes power, well, then we have to ask, who decides what counts as green, and who bears the cost? These tensions are not just philosophical, they play out in real time, especially in places where environmental mandates hit hardest, like the Global South. That's where we're heading next. Let's take a look at what green policy means when viewed through the lens of climate justice and global inequality. Now let's shift our focus and our perspective. Most of the world's major environmental policies, regulations, and treaties are drafted in boardrooms and government halls located in the global north. That includes the United States, Europe, Canada, and other wealthy industrial nations. But when those policies ripple out, who really feels the impact? Often, it's the global south, developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Here's the irony: many of these nations contributed the least to historic carbon emissions. They didn't lead the industrial revolutions. They weren't filling the skies with coal smoke or paving over continents. And yet, they're frequently asked to make the steepest sacrifices in the name of global climate action. Take for example bans on fossil fuel expansion. Wealthy countries that built their economies on oil and coal now pressure poorer nations to skip that stage entirely. But what happens when a country like Nigeria or India still relies on affordable energy to power hospitals, schools, or small businesses? These aren't just environmental questions, they're questions of justice, sovereignty, and survival. And then there's the issue of foreign investment. Sometimes, green initiatives come with strings attached. International aid or loans may require certain climate policies, like strict deforestation rules or limits on industrial development. On paper, it's sustainable, but on the ground, it can feel like coercion. A farmer in Indonesia or a miner in Peru might not see a solar panel. They might just see lost income, rising costs, or policies imposed from afar. This dynamic has sparked a global conversation about climate justice. Who gets to decide the pace of transition? Who pays for it? And are we empowering developing nations, or just telling them what they can't do? Because let's be honest, environmental policy is not just about science. It's about power, it's about history, and it's about whether sustainability will be something shared or something enforced. But what if there's a third way? What if innovation, freedom, and economic incentives could offer a better path, one that lifts people up instead of locking them down? Let's explore that possibility next. Now we arrive at one of the most overlooked, yet arguably most powerful, drivers of environmental progress: innovation fueled by freedom. Let's start with a simple idea. When resources become scarce, prices go up. And when prices go up, people get creative. That's the invisible engine of economic adaptation. It's why whales were saved, not by government decree, but by the invention of kerosene, which made whale oil obsolete. It's why aluminum went from being more expensive than gold to one of the most common materials on Earth, thanks to a breakthrough in refining technology. And it's why solar panels, once a niche luxury, are now cheaper and more efficient than ever, driven by competition and scale. This isn't magic, it's incentive. Entrepreneurs, inventors, and investors have every reason to solve environmental problems when doing so is profitable. Whether it's creating biodegradable packaging, electric tractors, carbon capture startups, or reforestation as a service models, the solutions coming out of the free market are dynamic, flexible, and fast-moving. And perhaps most importantly, they're voluntary. Nobody forces a startup founder to reduce emissions. They choose to because it's aligned with innovation, branding, and consumer demand. The same goes for customers who buy ethical products, companies that adopt cleaner logistics, or investors who shift funds into ESG portfolios. This is a bottom-up approach, not one dictated by global treaties, but shaped by human initiative. Contrast that with centralized systems. They often struggle with rigidity, unintended consequences, or bureaucratic delays. By the time a new regulation is passed, the problem may have already evolved. Markets, on the other hand, reward those who stay ahead of the curve. Now, none of this is to say that markets solve everything. But they do have one massive advantage: they scale ideas quickly and efficiently, and they respect local context. A decentralized energy solution in Kenya doesn't need approval from a climate summit, it just needs to work. So maybe the real question isn't markets or mandates, but rather, how can we empower more people, at every level of society, to become problem solvers? That leads us to our final reflection. When we pursue sustainability, are we aiming to control society or unlock its potential? Let's wrap this up. So now, we've reached the final stretch. We've explored the origins of environmental thought, the rise of regulation, the tension between centralized power and market freedom, and the global implications of going green. And throughout it all, one theme keeps surfacing: choice versus control. Let's face it, environmental goals are noble. Cleaner air, safer water, a healthier planet for future generations. No reasonable person is against these things, but the path we take to achieve them, that's where the real debate lives. Central planning often promises quick results. It can marshal resources, impose rules, and set clear national targets. But history teaches us that top-down control tends to come with trade-offs. Trade-offs in flexibility, in local sovereignty, in economic dynamism, and sometimes in freedom itself. Should sustainability be imposed or inspired? Because here's the moral tension: when saving the planet becomes a justification for unchecked authority, we have to ask, are we creating a greener world, or just a greener version of centralized control? On the other hand, when individuals, entrepreneurs, and communities are given the freedom to innovate, adapt, and invest in their own solutions, progress can be just as meaningful and far more resilient. So here's the challenge we leave you with: can we build a future where both the planet and liberty thrive? Where responsibility is shared, not mandated, and where sustainability isn't a commandment from above, but a calling from within? That's the real truth behind this history. If you found this video thought-provoking, we'd love for you to be part of the conversation. Like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. We explore the past not to repeat it, but to rethink it, and maybe, just maybe, to build something better. Check out our other videos for more deep dives into the systems, stories, and decisions that shape our world. Thanks for watching.